I didn't stay silent because I had nothing to say. I stayed silent because saying it felt like a risk I couldn't afford. There was a moment, quiet, ordinary, almost invisible, when I realized that speaking would change how I was seen. Not dramatically, not immediately, just enough to shift the balance. And in that moment, I chose to protect the version of myself that looked strong, even if it meant leaving parts of myself unspoken. At first, silence felt like control. It gave me time. It gave me composure. It allowed me to remain steady when everything inside me felt unsettled. I told myself that strength meant restraint, that not everything needed to be said out loud. So I swallowed reactions. I edited emotions before they reached my voice. I learned how to nod, how to pause, how to let things pass without revealing how deeply they landed. What I didn't notice was how heavy that silence became. Not all at once. Not enough to call it pain. Just enough to slow me down internally. I could feel it in the way my thoughts hesitated before forming sentences I would never say. In the way my chest tightened when something important surfaced and had nowhere to go. Silence wasn't empty. It was crowded with everything I was holding back. There were moments when I almost spoke, when the words pressed close to the surface, ready to be released. But each time, the same question stopped me. What will this cost me if I say it? I wasn't afraid of being wrong. I was afraid of being seen differently, of being perceived as weaker, less composed, less reliable. So I chose silence again, not because it felt right, but because it felt safer. Only later did I begin to sense the cost, not in what others thought of me, but in what I had quietly traded away. Something in me learned to stay contained even when it needed expression. Something learned that strength meant endurance, not honesty. And as I stood there, appearing calm, I didn't yet understand what staying silent was taking from me. Only that whatever it was already gone. I used to believe that strength was measured by how much you could carry without letting it show, not reacting, not asking, not needing anything from anyone. I admired that version of strength, quiet, composed, dependable, the kind that never disrupted the room. So when something hurt, when something mattered more than I wanted to admit, I treated silence as discipline, a way to stay intact, a way to remain unexposed. Over time, silence stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like expectation. People came to know me as steady, unaffected, easy to be around. I became the one who listened more than spoke, who absorbed tension without reflecting it back. And while that image felt safe, it also felt strangely narrow. There were parts of me that didn't fit inside it, reactions that had nowhere to go, thoughts that dissolved before becoming words. I told myself that speaking would complicate things, that naming feelings would introduce unnecessary weight, that strength meant knowing when to stay quiet. But what I never questioned was why silence always seemed to be my responsibility, why holding things in felt like maturity, while expressing them felt like weakness. That belief settled in quietly, shaping how I showed up without ever asking my permission. There were moments when I sensed the imbalance, though I didn't have language for it yet. Small hesitations before responding. A tightening in my chest when something important went unacknowledged. I would notice it briefly, then push it aside, convincing myself that not everything needed to be shared. Silence made me feel composed, but it also made me feel increasingly alone inside my own thoughts. What I didn't understand then was that silence can protect you, and still cost you something. That staying quiet can look like strength on the outside, while slowly disconnecting you from yourself on the inside. This story isn't about finding the right words or learning when to speak. It's about what happens when silence becomes the place you hide parts of yourself that were never meant to be carried alone. At some point, I stopped noticing when I was holding things back. Silence became automatic, a reflex rather than a decision. A feeling would surface, and before it could take shape, it would already be contained. I learned how to pause instead of respond, how to nod instead of clarify, how to let moments pass without marking them. It felt efficient. It felt controlled. And slowly, it began to feel normal. What made it difficult to question was how well it worked on the surface. Nothing broke. Nothing exploded. Relationships continued. Conversations flowed. I was praised for being calm, for being grounded, for not making things complicated. And every time someone described me that way, it reinforced the idea that silence was doing its job, that strength meant staying manageable. But there were small moments when the silence felt heavier than usual. Moments when something important went unacknowledged and lingered longer than it should have. I would replay conversations in my head, noticing what I didn't say instead of what I did. Not because I wanted to confront anyone, but because part of me needed to know whether my feelings would have mattered if I had allowed them to exist out loud. I began to sense a gap forming between how I appeared and how I felt. Outwardly steady, inwardly crowded. Silence gave me composure, but it also gave my thoughts nowhere to land. They circled quietly, unresolved, waiting for a space that never quite opened. I didn't feel dramatic or overwhelmed, just subtly displaced from myself. There were times when I tested the edge of speaking. I would consider sharing something small, something safe. But even then, the hesitation appeared. I weighed the cost before the words could leave me. Would this change how I was seen? Would it disrupt the balance? Would it make me look less capable, less contained? Most of the time, silence won. What unsettled me wasn't the absence of reaction from others. It was how easily I accepted that absence. I told myself that not everything needs validation, that strength involves independence, that needing less is better than needing more. But underneath those justifications was a quiet question I kept avoiding. At what point does self-control become self-erasure? Silence began to shape my expectations. I stopped anticipating understanding. I stopped waiting to be met. I learned how to rely on myself emotionally in ways that felt admirable, but also isolating. Strength, I realized, can quietly turn into distance when it's built entirely on restraint. There were moments of clarity, brief but sharp. Times when I noticed how quickly I dismissed my own reactions, how often I told myself it wasn't worth mentioning, how familiar that dismissal felt. Those moments didn't lead to change, not yet, but they left an impression, a sense that something important was being postponed indefinitely. I wasn't suppressing pain. That's what made it harder to notice. I was suppressing presence, the part of me that wanted to be seen without justification, the part that didn't want to prove strength by disappearing. Silence had kept me steady, but it had also narrowed the space where I existed fully. And without realizing it, I had begun to measure my worth by how little I needed, by how quietly I could carry things, by how easily I could be relied on without asking for anything in return. That version of strength felt safe. But somewhere beneath it, something was waiting. Patient, unresolved, for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. Silence didn't isolate me from others right away. What it did first was separate me from my own reactions. I learned to experience things at a distance, observing them instead of inhabiting them. When something touched a nerve, I felt it briefly, then contained it, the way you close a door without locking it. That habit became so familiar that I stopped questioning it altogether. I began to notice how quickly I redefined discomfort as strength. If something felt heavy, I told myself it was manageable. If a moment felt unfair, I reframed it as something to endure quietly. Silence gave me language for resilience, but it also gave me excuses. It allowed me to stay composed without asking whether composure was actually serving me. There were moments when I caught glimpses of what I was avoiding. A feeling would surface unexpectedly, a tightening, a sudden awareness that something mattered more than I had admitted. Those moments were brief. I learned how to smooth them over internally before they reached the surface. Not because I didn't trust others, but because I didn't trust what would happen if I let myself be fully seen. Strength, as I practiced it, required constant monitoring. I had to stay alert to my own reactions, filtering them before they became visible. I couldn't afford to be surprised by my own emotions. Silence demanded control, and control demanded distance. The more I perfected it, the less room there was for spontaneity or vulnerability. I noticed how this version of strength shaped my relationships. People relied on me without hesitation. They shared freely, assuming I would absorb without resistance. I rarely disrupted that dynamic, even when it left me feeling unseen. Silence kept everything stable, but stability came at the cost of reciprocity. There were times when I wondered whether anyone noticed how much I held back. Not in a resentful way, more with quiet curiosity. Would something shift if I spoke? Would anyone step closer, or would the space widen further? I never tested those questions directly. Silence spared me the answer. What made this pattern difficult to break was how invisible the damage felt. I wasn't falling apart. I wasn't unhappy in obvious ways. I was functioning. Well, even. But something essential felt muted, as if I were experiencing my own life through a filter I couldn't remove. I began to sense that silence wasn't just a response anymore. It was an identity. I was the strong one, the composed one, the one who didn't need much. That identity felt safe, but it also felt rigid. There was little room inside it for contradiction or need. Occasionally, I felt the urge to step out of that role, to speak without editing, to let a reaction exist without justification. Those urges were fleeting, easily dismissed as unnecessary or inconvenient. Silence had trained me to doubt the legitimacy of my own impulses. The longer I stayed silent, the more effort it took to imagine speaking again. Words began to feel unfamiliar, almost intrusive. Strength had become synonymous with restraint, and restraint had become automatic. I didn't realize it then, but something was approaching its limit. Not dramatically, not urgently, just inevitably. And somewhere beneath all that composure, a question lingered quietly, unresolved. How strong is a silence that requires you to disappear in order to maintain it? At some point, silence stopped feeling neutral. It began to carry weight. Not enough to be called pain, but enough to be noticed when I slowed down. I felt it in moments of stillness, when nothing demanded my attention, and I could no longer distract myself from what I was holding in. Silence had become something I carried with me, even when no one else was around. I started to recognize how often I chose silence before it was asked of me. I anticipated reactions. I assumed misunderstanding. I spared others the effort of meeting me halfway by not asking them to. That realization was uncomfortable, because it meant the cost I was paying wasn't imposed. It was maintained. There were moments when I felt a quiet resentment surface, not toward anyone in particular, but toward the pattern itself. I resented how natural it had become to shrink my presence, how instinctive it felt to make myself easier rather than more honest. That resentment didn't turn into anger. It turned inward, settling as fatigue. I noticed how rarely I felt fully present anymore. I was attentive, reliable, composed, but not fully there. Silence had taught me how to stay contained, not how to stay connected. I could sense the difference in small ways. The delay before responding, the absence of expectation, the way I no longer waited to be understood. Sometimes, I imagined what it would feel like to speak without measuring the outcome, to let a thought exist without softening it first. The idea felt distant, almost impractical. Silence had trained me to prioritize stability over truth, and stability had become something I protected without questioning. The cost of that choice became clearer in subtle losses. I lost spontaneity. I lost the ease of sharing without calculation. I lost the feeling that my inner world could move freely between myself and others. None of it disappeared suddenly. It faded quietly, the way habits do when they go unquestioned. I began to see how strength, as I had defined it, demanded constant self-monitoring. I had to stay aware of what I felt in order to suppress it in time. That vigilance was exhausting in ways I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge. Silence kept things orderly, but it required ongoing effort to maintain. There were moments when the silence felt almost too loud, not because it asked me to speak, but because it reflected back everything I had avoided. In those moments, I understood that silence wasn't protecting me from exposure. It was protecting others from my truth. And that realization shifted something fundamental inside me. I began to wonder who I was performing strength for, whether anyone had actually asked me to carry so much on my own, whether the version of me that looked strong was being valued, or simply relied upon because it was convenient. By then, silence no longer felt like safety. It felt like a trade I had outgrown. I could sense the edge of it, the point where restraint would stop being strength and start becoming loss. Nothing had changed outwardly yet, but inwardly, I was standing very close to a moment I could no longer postpone. I didn't reach this moment through courage or confrontation. There was no speech, no declaration, just a quiet awareness that something in me could no longer afford to stay contained. Strength, I realized, had never been about how much I could carry alone. It had been about how little I allowed myself to need, and that version of strength had taken more from me than I was willing to lose. Staying silent taught me many things. It showed me what balance looks like when effort stops moving in only one direction. It revealed how often I confused composure with presence and restraint with maturity. Most of all, it showed me that silence is not always wisdom. Sometimes it is simply endurance disguised as strength. Letting that truth settle didn't make me louder. It made me more honest with myself about what I was protecting and what I was slowly abandoning. If you stayed with this story until the end, thank you. Some stories are not meant to resolve anything. They exist to be recognized. If parts of this felt familiar, you don't need to explain why. That recognition is enough. There are more stories like this waiting. Not answers, not instructions, just quiet spaces where something unspoken can finally be seen. If you return for the next one, we'll continue from here, without pretending that silence never costs us anything.